You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, on CGTN. U.S. President Donald Trump's order to impose tariffs on about $60 billion worth of Chinese goods last week fueled fears that the China-U.S. trade war is inevitable, some say. In an effort to calm jitters and move things back on track, China and the U.S. have been in emergency consultations on trade issues. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang was in a meeting with the U.S. Congress delegation on March the 27th, led by the top U.S. senators. Li said relations between China and the U.S. have gone through some tortuous journey, but it's been moving forward. The U.S. officials agree with Li, saying China and America has no reason to pick a fight in trade. They said China and U.S. economic relations were essentially mutually beneficial and important. I recently caught up with Stephen Orlins, the president of the U.S. National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, who has work experience relevant to China for nearly 40 years. Let's listen to his unique and in-depth understanding on what is going on between China and the United States right now. Is this the most critical moment between our two countries?
Well, the most critical, I think we've entered a period of difficulty. I think it's a difficulty in all aspects. It's a difficulty on the economic side. We have trade issues. It's difficult on the diplomatic side. We've got foreign policy issues. And it's difficult on the strategic side. So you have all three that are interacting in what is not a very productive way. So it's a time of significant tension.
Are we smart enough to handle that, you think?
Are we smart enough to handle it?
That's a long sigh I heard. That's a long sigh I just heard.
Ultimately, the U.S.-China relationship in the long term is going to be decided by the peoples of China and by the peoples of the United States.
Well, you always say that. That's just a politically correct statement.
It's not politically correct.
Why not?
It's actually, in the United States now, people would criticize me for saying that. Because ultimately, the people of both countries are going to decide, do they want to have a cooperative relationship? What are the threats really facing the people? Do they really worry about things thousands of miles away? Or do they worry about, can they feed their children? Is the next generation going to have a better life? Is there going to be a terrorist attack? Is climate change going to create situations where the streets of New York were flooded? That's what people really worry about. And in the end, the people of New York and the people of Shanghai have the same worries. And I think ultimately that's what brings the countries together.
But that word ultimate seems to tell a very long road ahead. But now for now, politics is all about immediate politics these days.
I think the immediate politics of U.S.-China relations are difficult. I think, you know, the aluminum and steel tariffs were a tiny first volley in what's going to be a deteriorating trade situation.
What about that $60 billion?
The $60 billion is, of course, has not entered into force. We're now in a period of consultation. We don't even know what products yet are going to be covered by this tariff. There's going to be first an analysis of what products should be covered. Then there's going to be consultation with businesses and the people of the United States, with the Congress. They're going to have the ability to influence what these tariffs are, the amount of the tariffs, and what products are going to be subject to the tariffs.
If it is to be implemented. If it is to be implemented.
And again, the 90 days is not firm. If we're seeing progress, I would say, if I'm President Trump, and I'm seeing progress in trade issues, in investment issues, I would take that 90 days and extend it. Because once you've fired your first shot, you can't take that shot back. After the first shot is fired, China will, if history is any lesson, retaliate proportionately. So if there's 60 billion of Chinese goods being exported to the United States subject to tariffs, I would expect a similar amount of U.S. goods to be tariffed that is coming into China.
There are already plans.
That could be a downward spiral.
There are already plans and discussions among the Chinese business community about what that list would be, coming from China, punishing U.S. goods, for example, about agricultural products, about cars, about airplanes. Even some of those at the meeting recently at the CDF have been talking about that. Is that going to hit on target?
I expect China to respond proportionately. I think in terms of cars and airplanes, it's much more complicated than it is in terms of agricultural products. Agricultural products are produced in the United States. The full amount of the benefit, the revenue, goes to the United States. Cars and airplanes is much more complicated. You have the issue of alternative sources. So I would expect when China tariffs a good, they have an alternative source for that good. You can say, well, for Boeing, they could get Airbus. Well, it's not so simple. There's spare parts issues, there are maintenance issues, there are long-term contract issues. It's not as easy as it appears. For cars, most of the cars, the American cars sold in China are produced in China. They're not imported. So do you want to punish Shanghai, which produces, you know, a lot of the cars that are sold under American brands? If I were the mayor of Shanghai, I would certainly object to that. That's not a good thing for Shanghai.
But on the other hand, isn't this 60 billion that mentioned by President Trump, many of it punishing the American businesses? American businesses are operating all over the world. American businesses are operating here in China.
Tariffs are by definition something which punish some and reward some. You know, the argument I've had with the Chinese government for many, many years is reduce tariffs, having nothing to do with U.S.-China relations, but the tariffs punish the Chinese consumer.
Is it the American businesses that are likely to lose as a result? Because many of them are operating in China. They're using China still as a production base, as they're using many emerging and developing economies.
Most of the U.S. businesses here, no. Most of the U.S. businesses here sell within the Chinese market. So it's produced in the Chinese market and it's sold in the Chinese market.
And therefore, if China retaliates.
So the retaliation on tariffs would be for companies that are producing here and exporting from here.
From now until...
you know, on the U.S. side, you know, there are things that are produced in the United States and sold here, but it's, you know, obviously the trade deficit is very significant. What President Trump believes is that China has more to lose by entering in this tit-for-tat tariff increase than the United States does, because the United States has a trade deficit with China. What the U.S. government doesn't seem to understand is that most of China's exports are related to imports. So let's say the Apple phone would be an example, which is exported back to the United States. 90% of that value is imported into China and then exported. So when you put on tariffs, so let's say you put on tariffs which are so high that the good is no longer exported from China, China would then reduce its import of that 90%. So the effect on China, it would be an effect, but it would be rather marginal, not nearly as significant as people assume it's going to be.
But from now until November, this is going to be the midterm election. The question is Washington going to be rational during this period of time? You got many years dealing with politics in Washington when it comes to China-U.S. relations. What do you think, sir?
I think we have to be careful that there is a broad consensus in the United States that China has not been dealing fairly in terms of tariffs, tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and investment restrictions. It is not just the Trump administration that we saw a man, Sherrod Brown, who's going to be running for the Democratic nomination for president, is the senator from Ohio. He supports President Trump on this. Senator Schumer, my senator from the state of New York, says it's good that President Trump is doing this, and it's about time.
You know what?
So
you know what?
See
China bashing has never been rare in any U.S. politics over the past few decades. It has never been rare, particularly during the political season. It used to be about ideology, and now it is going to the trade and economic area.
Usually it's limited to the presidential election. And this is not, you know, this is not China bashing. This is actually policies which can be very damaging to the U.S.-China relations. And on top of the economic side, we have the strategic and diplomatic side, which is also deeply troubling. We had President Trump put out a national security document called the National Security Strategy, and Secretary Mattis put out the National Defense Strategy. The National Security Strategy branded China as a strategic competitor and a revisionist power. The National Defense Strategy said we must spend money, must be our primary priority, to spend money to defeat our rivals, which in this case meant China and Russia.
But Mr. Orlins,
so those are deeply troubling.
How, after so many years, the rising power and the incumbent power has learned about history, and will they, in a way, interact for the record of the history? What is your reading so far?
Well, so far it's been pretty good. Since a few months after the establishment of diplomatic relations, no war in Asia. I would say that's pretty good record. That the incumbent power and the rising power have actually found ways to cooperate to make sure that Asia has remained peaceful. We've seen hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. That's, again, that is an effect of the constructive relationship between the United States and China. If that relationship wasn't constructive, it would have been very hard for China to succeed the way it did.
But you know that China has never been, as today, over the past few decades, rising in the region. What do you think, Mr. Orlins? I mean, you've been dealing with this bilateral relations for a long time. What kind of vision is needed? Do you think the current White House has that vision?
I think the focus of the current White House is much more on confrontation than on cooperation. I think over time they will learn. Again, they're pretty new. Now we have a new group of officials coming in. We have a new Secretary of the State. We have a new National Security Advisor. But they will, over time, learn that to focus on the areas of cooperation, even when there are differences, is much more productive. That overstating differences is never a positive way to approach a problem. You want to, if you were married, you would focus on the areas where you can cooperate with your spouse, not the areas where you can't cooperate, where you have differences. It's true in any relationship, and it's true in relationships among states.
Some of the names in the lineup for the administration right now have remained hawkish for decades, and that is their brand name. So I really wonder, this learning curve that you just mentioned is really likely to happen or not.
Well, what National Security Advisor designate Bolton said, what I have said up till now, throw it out the window. That I'm going to relook at everything, and I'm going to follow the instructions of President Trump. President Trump has stated repeatedly that he has a good relationship with President Xi, that he respects and likes President Xi. So I take that as almost a form of insurance, that let's say things go bad, that we have bad trading relationships, bad strategic relationships. I would see President Xi and President Trump speaking and trying to put it back on the right track. That relationship in a lot of ways kind of gives us protection against the downside and is very important. And I give both sides enormous credit for having agreed to have those meetings very, very early on. And it's been helpful, and having Trump come to China was helpful. But obviously there are a lot of problems, and what both sides need to do is do something, I think, which is called play small ball. Small ball is find little areas where we can cooperate to build kind of the sense of trust and cooperation. That rather than a downward spiral, it becomes a virtuous cycle where this works and then that works. And they don't have to be big important things. They can be, you know, joint humanitarian efforts. They can be joint military exercises.
It has to start from somewhere.
China's going to participate in our military exercises off Hawaii later this year. And those are ways just to build cooperation. So you have to look for ways to build cooperation from the ground up and make it bigger and bigger.
Your words are rational, very reasonable, and very constructive. But Mr. Orlins, as you may know very well, the two countries experiencing bilateral relationships ups and down over the decades. Sometimes your words got across very clearly to the rest of your country. But sometimes your words not only not transmitting, but also even got criticized by some of the hawkish voices in your country. So I just wonder, what has been the recent days like for you?
Well, it's certainly, it's been difficult. That there are a lot of people who think, we've seen articles, we've seen speeches, we've seen a lot of discussion in the media that constructive engagement, the policy that I've supported since my time in the State Department 42 years ago, has failed. That they believe it has not served the American people, that China's WTO accession was a mistake, and that to me is it's very difficult because I've spent my life supporting this constructive engagement. And when I see it, you kind of say, oh, people are saying that what I've done for 40 years hasn't been great. I think that's wrong. I think it's fundamentally wrong. So when I feel that kind of thing, I don't retreat. I just stand up and say, okay, let's look at the record. Let's look at what has been accomplished. Let's look at that we haven't had war in Asia for decades. Let's look at the peaceful situation, and then let's really talk about whether constructive engagement has succeeded. I believe the argument is overwhelmingly that constructive engagement has succeeded. So when I get this criticism, it just makes me stand up straighter, makes me talk louder, and more often that this is a policy that served America, served China, and served the world because it's created peace and prosperity.
On the other hand, you've been working in China on and off for a long time, Mr. Orlins. I remember
before you were born.
Well, I wouldn't comment about that. But the thing is, I remember you tell some of the very beautiful stories of your earlier encounter with China. Now you see China at a very different stage. How would that work? I mean, China at this critical juncture for its own future. Well, be able to streamline its own house, while at the same time face pressures from outside, such as this bilateral relation with the United States. How would that work for China?
Well, first of all, I always see China in the context of the history that I've experienced in China. So I arrived in China almost 40 years ago today. The first time I came from the Beijing airport to the Peking hotel where I was to live for the next couple of years.
That's where the only foreigner could live, right?
That's where foreigners, we all live. But as I say, that we didn't, that night when we arrived, it was a two-lane highway. There were no street lamps. It was dark. We passed no other cars. We just passed ox carts and bicycles, and we arrived at the Peking hotel. In those days, the only good meal that my friends got was the meal that I bought them, because my friends didn't have the money to basically eat very well. So, we had, rou piao, we had fan piao, it was all of these things that we had. Now these friends drive BMWs and Mercedes and travel the world, and it's been, I always look at that as a miracle that I've gotten to witness, that I've watched friends get lifted out of poverty. So I see, 改革开放 as having combined with the relationship with the United States, as having allowed these people, my friends, to become wealthy, to have children who are better educated, to be able to travel the world.
Yes.
So I see everything in the context of the history. So when I see what's happening today, and I know that it's imperative for the Chinese to continue down the 改革开放 road, that the reform and opening has created this success, and in continuing that, it will continue to lift more people out of poverty, to be the responsible stakeholder in the world that I hope that China will be. So I remain optimistic, and I listen to the speeches of the leadership, and I hear that they remain committed to reform and opening. They remain committed to foreign businesses.
That's very important.
Being here.
That's our interview with Stephen Orlins, who is a former diplomat and now president of the National Committee on US-China Relations, on the recent trade dispute between China and the United States and on the overall road ahead between the two countries from his perspective. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.